Okay, we're on. All right.
Welcome everybody back after the break. Perhaps I can read through the chats to see what was being said while the recording was being played. The first one is I'm not hearing any audio. Remember that? Then you have to click share sound and then no. And then here we get into the interesting stuff. Pretty messy story, isn't it? Then someone else wrote, it's the human condition. Then I never understood that when Isaac learned he was deceived, he could not reverse his blessing. Then another one's, I never understood that blessing thing. It's a story to justify the nation's actions later on in history. So much communication from God. Why is God just silent in our days? Apparently silent, or apparent silence. How is there more to the story that was left out? Would be a fantastic movie with all the twists and turns. So much deception and treachery in people who profess to be followers of God. Nice piece of literature, question mark. But all of those crooked people were blessed by God. And the moral of the story is what? Perhaps the Lord works with people as he finds them consistent with his purposes. What were his purposes then in this story? Seems human nature has not changed. What is God waiting for? Why doesn't he come and restore the earth? Does every story have to have a moral? Can't we just enjoy it? What is the point then? It's just a terrible story of sin. Classic tale of family feuds and an endless chain of deceptions, and finally a truce. Competes very well with Shakespeare. This is one disturbing point because there was so much sin, according to our morals now, and still everything was based on, thus says the Lord. Seriously, I am almost at the point of saying, again, nice creative piece of literature, fiction written at that time, question mark. Narrative, narrative style usually reflects the presuppositions of the era they were written in. Nice reading, David. Thank you, George. All right. I'd like to go back to Ed and ask Ed if he's still here to talk more about this line. Narrative style usually reflects the presuppositions of the era they were written in.
Yeah, I just, as I was listening to this, I was reflecting on some of the research I did back in the 70s and 80s on my doctoral dissertation. And I found out, that this here, it's a beautiful narrative, but it's all pre-scientific, it's tribal, it's all oriented around family. The moral traditions are totally alien to what, we talk about today in terms of marrying your sisters, your cousins, and all that crossover. And, there's a lot of communication with the gods. So this doesn't astound me. It's just part of the style for whenever these stories began to evolve into these books that came together as the Old Testament.
Well, how would you respond to the question earlier in the chat? And that was something like this. Well, God seems to be speaking to them a lot, but God doesn't seem to be speaking to us at all. What's going on here?
Well, I think God is speaking to us as much as he's speaking to them, but he's doing it in different ways. God speaks to me, and I look right out here to my right, And I've got, 5 or 6 different varieties of birds right here, and I watch them raise their young. And God's speaking to me at that point. So it all depends.
Interesting. And you put on Facebook, I think, a new companion of yours in Florida, a lizard or something. What was that?
Well, he's not a companion. He's a good friend. Somebody told me on Facebook that was I forget the name of it, and I just happened to be out and about, and I saw this thing about 24 inches long, beautiful, very bright green, and I said, "That's interesting." I didn't get any communication from him though.
You're going to have to work on your communication skills a little bit. I'd like to continue this just a little while longer. I see Peter wants to get in here and we'll get him in there. But where is Karsten? He said something like, why does the story have to have a point? It's a classic tale of family feuds and so forth, competes very well with Shakespeare. Karsten, are you around?
Yeah, I'm here.
Please say more.
I try to accept your premises for listening to the story. That is, listen to it as a historical story. And I had to then park all my preconceived notions from my childhood about that every Bible story has to have a moral, that there are the good guys and the bad guys, and that God only blesses the good guys, and so on. And I'll have to admit, just with a wonderful reading, his voice and the way he read it, I was sitting at the edge of my movie theater seat. It was an exciting story. It was a thrilling story. It competes with some of the modern things like House of Cards or Game of Thrones and things like that. And I enjoyed it just as a fantastic story. Anything wrong with that?
No, any more than there's anything wrong with looking at a painting and saying, I'm enjoying that painting. If suppose someone looked at a Van Gogh and said, well, what is the point of this? What is the moral? What is the lesson I'm supposed to learn from this? Wouldn't that be a little bit odd?
But there are, shall we say, things in there that I think are deep reflections of human character. I mean, do people learn from the mistakes? No, they learn from their parents' mistakes and they repeat them again and again and again, generation after generation. That's one of the big themes of the story, about the deception and with a beautiful wife when they have run off to Egypt. You lie about that, and having problems getting children, and then the very cynical moral of the story: don't listen to your wife; she'll get you into trouble. Sarah got Abraham into trouble, created 2 warring religions because of that, and Rachel was a liar and a deceiver. And I thought it was just so funny the way that she sat on the things that she stole from Laban. He finally got his just deserving. Somebody was more clever and more deceitful than he was. But I think Laban is probably the one whose name is preserved most in history from that story.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and then, if we come back to say it's in the Bible, why is it in the Bible? Well, it turns out that actually both the good guys and the bad guys, it wasn't black and white, and God did bless both the good guys and the bad guys. Mm-hmm. And the rain falls on the just and the unjust. I think the complexity of that story is fascinating. And is also liberating in one respect, because if we were to pull the curtains on our own church today and see what goes on behind the scenes, it'd be at least just as fascinating and exciting and filled with corruption and lies and deceits and so on. It's always been that way. But back in this Bible days, they didn't censor what went on behind the scenes.
I was going to say I have a colleague. He's not my colleague. He's my dean. So he's on a higher level in the administrative structure. Leo Ranzelin, who really loves the plays of Shakespeare. And he tries to work through one carefully every summer. He has a good knowledge of them all, but he wants to have a detailed knowledge of one of them every summer. And he says that what he finds most valuable as a theologian, looking at the plays of Shakespeare, is that there is no greater depiction of human nature than one finds in Shakespeare. And I wonder, somebody commented along these lines in the chat, I wonder if this doesn't show human nature at its best and at its worst. And that's sort of a mirror. These stories are mirrors so that we can see ourselves in them. Now, we may be puzzled, but the Bible is the most widely read book in the whole history of humanity and will continue to be so. So even if we don't believe a word of it, just to be a well-informed person, we ought to think about these stories. Now, there are two more messages down here, if I can see. I love Carson's way of addressing the issues. Okay, let's see. Regarding the quilt Michelle made for Rod, I just love the beautiful quilt and thought that went into making it, and the thought that went into making it, that Michelle made for Dean years ago. Remember, we lost Dean years ago. Seems like yesterday, doesn't it? I still treasure and use it. Okay, I didn't realize that was heading in that direction, though. Thank you, Alicia. Forrest, over.
Okay, we got Peter. Peter, you're up. You should be on, Peter.
Okay, first, I'd like to say hello to Karsten. We are good friends to Scourby and Bertie, your brother and sister-in-law.
Yes, that's right. My brother is in California right now, and his wife is in Denmark right now. He's fixing up a little bit of house. So I'll give them my regards. They're often online also, not today.
Yeah, we met with them a few weeks ago, just before they, Bertie left for Denmark. These are beautiful stories, and there are a few things that we can pause and talk a little bit about them, especially the customs that were practiced during this time. Well, the first idea that interests me is the idea of covenant. God made a covenant with Abraham and renewed this covenant with Isaac. And God promised that it will multiply the seed of Abraham and then Isaac as the stars of the sky. And I'm thinking of the history of the Jews throughout the centuries, how they were persecuted, but despite all these persecutions and tragic history that they have, there are still about 15 million of them living today. And this is a blessing in my view, and it's a sign of God's promise that he made to them. Of course, the promise, covenant was done between them. God conditioned this by their obedience and their closeness to him. Another idea that I can talk about it is Abimelech, the king of Philistines. It's interesting that at that time, the pagans, of course, he was considered a pagan, the Philistines, he was their king, he obeyed God. I mean, he had that dream and he believed that God was speaking to him, and he obeyed that and made a covenant with Isaac and became friends with him, close friends. Another idea that I got from these stories is that marriage during that time was considered a blessing and a favor from God. And not having children, being barren, was not considered a favor from God. That Rebecca prayed earnestly that she would have children, and finally she got children. And also Sarai was praying and having children, child in her old age. In regard to the marriage, it's interesting the custom that was in existence at that time. The parents played a major role in this. They were choosing basically the person that their sons supposed to marry. And this has happened with Abraham sending his servant and getting married with somebody from his family, for his son. Getting a wife for his son from his family. And interesting enough, both Abraham and Isaac decisions to get married, to get their brides, happened at the well. It looks like in the old times, the wells were interesting places where the people met, and some decisions were taken, some good discussion took place. Also, in regard to the marriage, we have to notice that polytheism was practiced. And interesting enough that both these people, Isaac and Jacob, they were marrying their cousins. And if I recall correctly, by the Levitical law, this was later on prohibited, but that they were marrying their own cousins. That's interesting, marriages made in the family. And another interesting thing that we can talk about is Rebecca stealing the idols of her father, Laban. Why that? Why did she do that? The Ebla tablet, it's clarifying for us why that happened. She stole the idols of her father because this was a sign of property. Who had the idols of the house, it was a sign that it was empowered to have the property. Also, I'd like to mention in regard to marriage that the custom to give if the wife was barren, to give in marriage the servant. And also this is clarified by the Ebla tablets that it was practiced during that time. This has happened with Sarai, and usually the servants, when they're giving birth on their knees as a sign of child being belonging to her, not to the servant. Interesting customs, but we can understand from Ebla tablet why they practice that. Now, in regard of characterizing a little bit describing a little bit the characters. Of course, both Rebecca and Jacob, they were practicing, they were deceiving. And they accomplished their goal through deceiving. Rebecca deceived Isaac, and Jacob also deceived his father, and also, in a way, we can call also deceiving Laban that when he changed what he's supposed to get for his service. Well, I will stop here.
Thank you, Peter. Just one procedural issue. I'm happy to see the chats and happy to see them come up on the screen. And I'll leave them there for long enough, I think, for people to read them. And then I'll click them off. I'm not trying to prevent people from seeing them, but I would rather not have the screen filled with all these comments. So let's read them, and then I'll turn them off. Now, Peter, you have overviewed much material as usual, and much material in a helpful way. And it all, at least most of it, refers to the second of the 5 literary elements, as they're called, and this has to do with setting. And Ed talked about this too. The setting is so different and so intriguing that I think instead of just being repulsed by it, we might want to enter into this almost as though we were anthropologists of a participant observant style, and sort of try to feel what that world was like inside. It's no value to us just to look at that from the outside and say, wow, isn't that strange? That really is weird. Da, 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 da. No, we need to sort of plunge ourselves into that setting and try to see the world through the eyes that they had. So I really appreciate you bringing up these situational factors. Now, I want to ask Peter a question, and then we'll get it back to Forrest. Here's the question. I sat next to the wife of one of the Death of God theologians who was Jewish at a professional meeting. I think I've told this story already, but I didn't realize that she was the wife of the speaker, Richard Rubinstein, what's his name? And he was one of the 4 Death of God theologians of the time. And we introduced ourselves to each other. Then I knew who she was. And then her husband said up front, as a Jewish philosopher, I think the idea of the covenant is the worst thing that has ever happened to the sons and daughters of Abraham. And I turned to her and I said, does he really mean that the covenant is the worst thing that has happened to the sons and daughters of Abraham? She said, he really believed that because it has caused us to have so much trouble, so much pain, so much heartache, and so forth. What would you say in response to that philosopher about the covenant?
Well, they forget that God blessed them and took them out of Egypt conditionally. And when he gave them the country of the territory of Canaan and told them the borders and how much he's going to bless them, and told them that from your reading that you are going to have houses that you didn't build and drink from the wells that you didn't dig, and all the blessings that you are going to receive in this country, but they are conditional. You have to be closer to me and to obey my commandments. And they didn't do that. And throughout the Old Testament, we can see that there are 2 things in particular that they're guilty of: idolatry and the social problems that they have. They didn't respect the rights of the poor and obey God's law, how to treat them and to be fair in all their life and be fair to him. And but I believe that they are forgetting this conditional covenant. And I remember one of the stories during Frederick the Great. He had a Jewish physician, and one day Frederick was talking with his physician and told him, well, show me a sign that now the Jews were really blessed, and it's a miracle of their existence. And the Jewish physician answered, well, the Jews are that miracle that you are talking, and asking me to provide you Because, as I mentioned, throughout centuries, they have so many problems and persecutions, pogroms against them and all that. And there are still 15 millions today.
That's right.
The-
That's right.
It is.
And not only are they 15 millions, but in every walk of life, they are often at the very pinnacle of success, all the way from entertainment to science and so forth and so on. So, yeah, I think you're right. They have not lived up to the covenant, and they have suffered from that. On the other hand, it seems to me that the blessing Abraham and his descendants received is still evident to some degree. So, thank you, Peter. I need
Yes,
to hand it over
yes,
to Forrest.
because according to the prophets, especially the small prophets, the promise God made them that they will come back and they will continue to worship Him and to repent of their sins, He will be gracious to them again.
Yes.
And it was not a complete, abandonment of them. It was because they sinned for a period, they were punished, but God told them that even them there in the captivity, Babylonian captivity, if they will pray and they will return to Him, He will be gracious to them again.
Right. So Paul says in Romans 9 through 11, all Israel will be saved. But
Yes,
along the way, he has redefined Israel from being a genetic thing to being a spiritual thing. And so it's a very clever thing Paul has done there. It begins with one definition of Israel, ends with another definition of Israel. And that second definition of Israel is broad enough to include people like me. And I like that.
and another amazing thing that we can mention is that look at the Nobel Prizes. How many the Jews have? I mean, the majority of the Nobel Prizes, they belong to the Jews.
That's right. That's right. Okay, over to you. Thank you, Peter. Over to you, Forrest.
Okay, I want to go to Simona. Simona?
Thank you. Well, when we were talking about story, I think one aspect that should be mentioned is that the power of story to maintain identity. It is not an accident that people who have powerful stories or mythologies maintain their identity better than those who don't have them. And this is true throughout the history. So I think these stories, however strange to us today, and particularly from the moral standpoint, they are abhorrent, I think, in many ways. But these are the stories of identity. This is where we come from, right? This is for Jewish people. This is where we come from. This is who we are. This is where we belong. And I think these stories that maintain identity all carry these elements of belonging, of knowing who you are, or knowing your purpose, or knowing where you come from. So that's besides of all these things that we may talk about on the spiritual level, I think these are very, very important parts of identity of Jewish people. I want to address something else. Somebody was saying how come that God was speaking so much to people then, and today there is only silence. I think people then were probably more open to hearing things in a way that enabled God to speak more directly. I don't know what I would do if suddenly there would be a voice from heaven. I would probably go to the first psychiatrist I could find. So, I think people were less cynical than we are today. It's just consider, like, maybe 20 years ago, if you saw somebody walking on the street and talking to themselves, you thought this person needs a physician. And now chances are they're just speaking to somebody on a Bluetooth. So, times change, modalities change, the question is, how open are we to communication? I think that that is where each one of us needs to give our personal answer.
Yes, real quickly for us. When we have these strong impressions, and I have had them, and so has everybody else, I don't think we can ever satisfactorily answer the question, was that God speaking to me? I think, though, we can satisfactorily answer this question, should I treat this as though it were God speaking to me? And one can consult with one's colleagues on that basis. So maybe sometimes our colleagues will say, no, you should not treat that as if it is God speaking to you. Or they might say, yes, and I've had my colleagues share with me on both of those accounts. But I don't ask my colleagues to determine whether it was really, really God. Who knows?
Okay, David, thank you. I'm going to go to, and I see Anastasia. I got,
When my turn
Uh,
comes,
yeah, I will. Okay, Rodney, to you,
whenever
sir.
my turn comes. Yeah,
Of course.
thank you.
Yeah,
Firstly,
Rodney, go.
yeah. Firstly, I really like all the comments that have been made this morning, and I thank everybody for their enlightened comments. I'm going to make 5 quick observations here. The first one is that I need to read and study and understand these Old Testament patriarchs more and better than I do. So I'm embarrassed that at my stage of life and with my Adventist background, I didn't listen and hear and read as I should have done. And so I do need to read some Hebrew commentaries on this. How do the Hebrews interpret their own stories here? Much more revealed in there than possibly than what we would understand this morning. The second thing is, and I believe this for a long time, that DNA was important to God. People married within the tribe, and they were contract relationships. And although it's not consistent with practices today, if you look at practices at the time, this was widely spread in all nations in Mesopotamia. And the rule back to the earliest time, to the Garden of Eden people, the black-haired people, the Sumerian people, was, it's okay, the father's the same, but the mother must be different. And that was the dividing rule, and it shows some very early understanding of DNA. I think the third thing to me was blended families are difficult. I'm not part of a blended family, and I thank God that I'm not part of a blended family. I have many cousins and relatives that are, and as someone who doesn't have children, I have time to look at just how difficult that can be, and I'm glad that practice what's supplanted. But however, we all know, and we know many people, many families that are blended, and I don't pass judgment on the tour. I just see it's a difficult situation. I think the fourth thing that, and I kind of understood this before, but it's reinforced here, and that is blessings in the Old Testament were always tangible. You know, people did not say, well, I feel blessed. It wasn't a declaration of a state of emotional enhancement. Blessings were wives, children, wealth, property, very, very tangible things. I think we use the word blessings today in a much more expanded sense than what is expressed in the Old Testament.
Sorry, Rodney, was that number 3? That what you
was
just
number
read?
that was number 4.
Oh, I missed one. What's number 3?
Number 2 was, I got to read more and understand better than I do. I'm embarrassed. Number
Right.
2 is DNA was important. And the tribe, marrying within the tribe was important, and that was practiced all through Mesopotamia. So within the context of time, it was a common practice in the known world. The third was the blending of families, simply making an observation. I'm happy to conduct that. Blending of families is difficult. Takes much more work. The fourth was blessings were tangible. They weren't enhanced states of mind. The fifth one is these stories are there for one reason, and that is to reveal God to us in some way. And that to me is a strategic question. We get caught up in detail and tactics, but what was God trying to achieve? What was his purpose? And to me, clearly was he wanted to and chose to build a new nation from amongst lost nations, corrupt nations that he could not identify with or be proud of. This was not his purpose. And so he was a nation builder. And if you think strategically and not tactically, you go back to the beginnings, God's promise to the people was, I will never leave you. I will be who I will be, which means I will do whatever it takes. And God always used humans. They're the tools. They're his people. And he used flawed people all the way through and still does. And we need to reconcile to that. There's not necessarily God choosing sin or deceit. He has to work with the tools that he has got, and they are flawed people over time and within time. So I'm somewhat an open theist and understand the power and importance of storytelling. But I believe that God will do whatever it takes to meet his purposes, including using very flawed people and difficult situations. Thank you.
Wow. Think strategically, not tactically. That's a line that summarizes all 5 points, I think. Thank you, Rodney. Back to Forrest.
Okay, I'm ready coming to you, Anastasia, for your quick question. You're muted, Anastasia. There you go.
I don't hear quick questions about others, but thank you, Forrest. You like me especially, so I appreciate it, though I'm flawed. Oh, wow, where to start? I have, one of my sons is married to a Jewess, which we love her and adore her in the family. I don't want to say but. I want to say I thank God and praise God that he sent us Jesus and that Jesus came. And I thank God that he's not dealing in theocracy anymore, although I do agree that he's used very flawed and terrible situations and terrible people for his over plan, I trust. But when I get an impression or prayer, whatever, that God, and I believe he talks to me, I check it out with the scriptures about Jesus, what he said, how he said that we are the adopted. It's not theocracy anymore. We are the adopted children, and how terribly they misunderstood him. And then when I try to form the nature of God, I look at Jesus, because if I only had those stories of the Old Testament, I would not believe in a God. I doubt it very much, with all due respect, that God talked to these people to do the atrocities, the terrible treatment of women, the terrible atrocities, and still some nationalists use it to suppress the other people, claiming superiority, etc., etc. So our eyes should be upon Jesus. Those things that are in accordance with his nature, Jesus spoke to them, but they misunderstood him, and he said he had to come and fulfill the law. He had to show who the Father was. So they misunderstood. God doesn't tell you to go and kill your child to prove your faith. God doesn't tell you some of those terrible things. They misunderstood God terribly. God used them for a better plan, but God forbid that God told them those things. As of Shakespeare, who took from the Greeks the tragedies, please read them. You will see such a superiority to those stories. Their hero, who had, like Achilles and others, were mostly good with one big flaw, and there were terrible consequences, mostly because of their hubris. So they were mostly, quote, good. Some of these characters there and what they promote about women and all this, thank God Jesus came. It's terrible, and I'm sorry, but I thank you.
Thank you.
Anastasia, did you say that the classics have better stories or worse stories? I wasn't quite sure, or just different?
I want to say that in the Greek, because Shakespeare was brought up, and
Mhm.
Shakespeare copied and inspired by the Greek tragedies. In the Greek tragedies, both of men and women, like Iphigenia, like Oedipus, and et cetera, the main character is mostly, quote, virtuous, is a good. And good takes a whole half an hour to explain what the Greeks meant about good. But they had a flaw, a very fatal flaw. And mostly they thought too much of themselves, hubris. And that brought terrible consequences to them and to their families. And so, yes, I found a lot more of morality on that than in the stories of Abraham and his family.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you.
You know, Anastasia, I appreciate your story. You remind me of the movie My Big Fat Greek Wedding, where the father always is saying, well, we have to go back to the Greeks.
You said that so too, and I'm afraid it's true.
Okay,
It's
David, did you
true.
want to respond to that anymore? Okay, McKinley.
Thanks, Forrest. I might be echoing some of the things that have been previously said, but I think they're relevant to my comments. I like the light-hearted aspects of the conversation so far, particularly in the chat. The story is a complicated story of human elements, sibling rivalry, family dysfunction, but also divine purposes and expressions. And it also seems to me that it's a story about the beginnings of the people of Israel. Setting aside the dysfunctions and the conflicts of the families, a few things stand out for me. First, the covenant and the blessings that Peter talked about. My observation is that those blessings continue today. And interestingly, when I've been researching the topic that I've shared in our potluck conversation, even in science, Dr. Einstein, as you probably know, was Jewish, and his contributions of the theory of relativity and the equation that is so familiar with a lot of people, E equals to mc squared, has blessed humanity. So setting aside the spiritual application of the blessing, the covenant blessing, we can even see in that science application, all of humanity being blessed. Okay, the second point, addressing a point that David teed up concerning a picture of God or elements of a picture of God that emerges. I was intrigued, and I've always been intrigued by the transaction between Eliezer and Rebecca, or Rebecca's family. In the dialogue there, I noticed that his Eliezer's request for the Lord's guidance played a very important part in his mission. The other thing that I noticed is that there was provision for that guidance. And then the third thing to notice is his attribution to God from the events that happened in his experience. The third thing also I want to point out is that I guess allowing Rebecca to go with Eliezer as Isaac's candidate wife, the family sought Rebecca's consent. So notwithstanding our view sometimes that the people back there did not respect the wishes of women, it was very interesting to me. I think it was in 24 verse 58 that the family sought Rebecca's consent before she embarked on that journey. Finally, other practical observations about the blessings. A few years ago, I read a book about the US and Britain in Bible prophecy. This was not a book by an Adventist person, but when the blessings of these two nations are mapped back to the blessings, the covenant blessings in Genesis, it is very hard to dismiss that those blessings have been realized today across these two nations. So those are my observations.
Okay, thank you. I want to go to, okay, David, I'm looking at our time. I've got Monte up there, and then I've got Simona again. I'm going to take those two, and then I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, real quickly in response to McKinley, I'm glad he noticed that Rebecca's consent was required. I noticed that, but I didn't get the full force of that and how that honors at least her decision-making as a woman. Thank you, McKinley, for that and for everything else.
Okay, Monte, I'm going to come to you.
Sure. One of the things that I've been thinking about a lot recently is how my work on resolving the problem of pain and thinking about that, how that interacts with my other theological beliefs. And what I've been hearing a lot today in this discussion certainly is in conflict with my resolution of the problem of pain. And so I guess my thought challenge to the rest of the class is, how do you think through the problem of pain? For example, one common way is to say that God is either limited by his morals or he's limited in some other way by the metaphysics of the universe from interfering in such a way that pain would be absent. How does that then mesh with your ideas about these various blessings and God interfering in such a way that people have more children than other people and flocks are more prolific than other flocks? I just think it's an interesting exercise because we sometimes resolve some things theologically in one way, but then that doesn't mesh with our other beliefs. So just some food for thought.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. David, did you want to respond to that?
Oh, yeah, we're very quickly. Monte has picked up the Euthyphro dilemma, and we need to address that along the way. Just really quickly, I think we're going to have to update our views of evil, update our views of love, and update our views of power. I think if we stick with what is commonly understood by those terms, we're going to get really, really stuck. But that's a whole issue, and let's take some time to explore it more fully later. Thank you, Monte.
Thank you. Okay, Simona, I'm going to let you end this and a short question.
Well, I rarely have short questions, but you mentioned My Big Fat Greek Wedding. There is a sentence in there, I mean, a scene in there when the wife goes and she, her daughter wants to go to college and her father is against it. And she's like, well, he's head of the family. If he says no, then it's no. And she responds, yeah, he is the head, but the wife is the neck, and the head turns where the neck turns.
Yeah.
So I'm just, Anastasia knows what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
But I would like to say, in these terms, Einstein had a wife whose name was Mileva. She was from Serbia, and my grandmother actually knew her. And she was an outstanding mathematician, and much of the mathematical contribution to Einstein's theory came from her, not from him. And her work has never been recognized. And this has been true throughout the ages, that women's work was not recognized. And to this day, there are men who are building careers on contributions that were made by women. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And I agree. I think too many times the males have got the credit and the women have not. That's true. I hope that's changing now. David, I'm going to turn it over to you for the closing remarks. And before we go to the foodless potluck.
Okay, the foodless potluck comes up under McKinley's leadership. as soon as we conclude here. Just a footnote to what Karsten and what Monte have said. I think we're dealing with the problem of evil. Pain as such is not necessarily wrong. A certain amount of pain is helpful. Also, suffering as such is not necessarily wrong. But when pain exceeds its benefits, it becomes evil. And when suffering exceeds its benefits, then it becomes evil. And so we need to address the problem of evil, and that has to do with evil we create. It has to do with evil that the natural world creates, but it also has to deal with evil in an ecological sense. The predatory nature of the whole ecological system is something we really have to think about hard as Christians. So the discussion continues. Thank you, everybody. Roy would have been pleased that we discussed the Bible so interestingly and so well. Thank you very much. Now, remember, these are the good old days about which someday we are going to be nostalgic. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Amen.
Very good, David. Thank you.